historically have not gotten as much attention as the Mother's Day thing. My dad was always getting like a tie last minute. It wasn't even a brand new tie. It was just a tie. And my dad was the kind of guy that wouldn't have done well in the pandemic because he didn't even wear a mask when he was drywalling, you know, and he was always kind of like addicted to work. It was his religion. So he'd come home with half his body parts missing. He was like, oh, where's that elbow? He was always smoking a player's plane. So he would have thought the virus couldn't get him with the smoke. And he was one of those guys that everybody liked, you know. My aunts loved him. And my mother would have her sisters over in the living room and they'd be talking and then Jim would come in. You're married to one of the good guys, Gwen. And Dad would always tell one of his ridiculous jokes, those dad jokes. Like he's like, 2 men are looking over the fence at a nudist camp. And one guy says to the other, I'd like to see her in a sweater. Yeah, he'd be killed on Twitter. But then Dad would make up this little drink for the ladies because he didn't like that they could drink pure alcohol. So he would make up what he called a pink lady. And Tiffany's going to put the recipe up there on YouTube for you. I'll tell you what the recipe essentially is. It's frozen lemonade and then ice crushed and then any kind of alcohol people gave him for Christmas. Because my dad wasn't a big drinker, so he just poured anything in there. And if you drank his booze and you watered it down, he didn't know about it for months. Did you put the pink lady recipe up there, Tiffany? Well, thank you. My dad was the kind of guy that didn't display emotions. You know, if he cried, like if I phoned him and I was crying, he'd be like, okay, talk to your mother. Do you want a check? I'll write you a check. You know, that was the kind of guy. Like my husband was the type of man who'd say, if I was in an emotional mood, he'd go, do you think it's your hormones? And I go, no, it's you. But my dad didn't go near emotions. He was like, your mother's in a mood, lob a chocolate bar at her and get in the van. See, my dad loved his van. This kind of guy that would drive to the end of the driveway in the van to get the mail. He was the kind of guy that if GPS had been invented, he would have thought it was lying. He believed that once you got in the car, you didn't stop. We went to PEI when I was a kid, and I think we got halfway through Quebec before he let us have a pee break. We got to New Brunswick, and he saw the magnetic hill, and he said, there's the magnetic hill. We could go there, but we'd all be going backwards, and, well, that would lose time, because he was in a hurry. And we were in this little station wagon with 8 people, and that was the days before seatbelts, and we're like bouncing around, and every time he turned a corner, we'd slam into each other. It was kind of like a ride at Disney World, except without the height requirement. And it seemed to me that all of his work involved some sort of driving. See, when I was little, he had this part-time job on Saturdays where he drove an ice cream truck up north to Caladar, which is north of Napanee, and he'd deliver ice cream to all the convenience stores. And he'd pull up, and I'd be in the front seat, and he'd see all these men sitting outside the convenience stores, a lot like they do in Tim Hortons, except they were like, how are you doing, Jimmy? And my dad would say to me, I'll just be a minute. And his minute was an hour. And I'd watch, and I'd wait for him to come back to me, because then I could have a fudge-sicle. I could have a fudge-sicle at 10:30 and another ice cream at 2:30. And at lunchtime, we would sit at the back of the truck, leaning against it, squinting into the sun, eating our bologna sandwiches that he'd pulled out of the freezer. And there was little ice crystals around the bologna rind. And I can still smell his Old Spice cologne. As you get older, you start to look back on things with more sentimentality. But when COVID hit, it's like my life has flashed before my eyes. I remember so much about him. My dad would never have stayed home during COVID. He was a restless verb. He'd drive his van down the mean streets of Napanee like he was running for mayor. But he wasn't mayor, he was the town clerk. He'd been waving at everybody. See, my whole family was in municipal politics down here. My uncle was the fire chief. And my other cousin was the building inspector. And my mother ran the roads. And I want to be clear about something. My dad didn't become the town clerk of Napanee. He was the town clerk of Richmond Township, which was just a field over from Napanee, but he was very clear about that. To an outsider, it might look like nothing was going on. But Richmond Township, there was an underground pond of mystery and intrigue. And he was the first town clerk to actually enforce the dog tag law. This might be great for the tax base, but I can tell you, taxpayers didn't want to buy a dog tag. My dad always had these bright ideas, like one of them was, let's get my kids to sell dog tags. We had to go door to door and try to convince people who had never had dog tags to buy them. And I learned a lot about the human condition. And that is, people lie about having a dog. No matter that their dog raced out to bite you, no matter that there's kibble in the front stoop, no matter that there was a pillow full of hair, they would deny canine ownership. And when we complain, my father would say, you are the ambassadors of Richmond Township. It was child labor. My dad had the bunch of ideas. He was the idea man. My mother owned a store called Kimmett's Color Corner, a paint and wallpaper store, and Dad decided that Kimmett's Color Corner would all be Ks. 3 Ks. Didn't consider that it was K, K, K. He also opened a hamburger joint called Big Jim's, and then he shortened it to BJ's. Enough said. Yes, he was the idea man, but he always had this posse of men that he drove around. He took them to the Royal Winter Fair, and when I worked at Second City, he'd take them all, and while they'd be laughing, he'd be looking around like, who's laughing at my girl? And then when I got off stage, it was like he hadn't seen the show. He said, well, what have you been up to? I'm just performing. But he always had these guys called Don and Harold and Doug, and third cousin twice removed called Garney. Cousin Four Eyes, they called him. And Garney talked like, well, geez, I'm heading over to my and get a bitch and son of a bitch. And you were like, I don't know if he was drunk or sober, but he sounded the same no matter what. And they all hung off every single word my dad said. Because he had a collection of one-liners to match any occasion. Get it in writing. Tell it to the judge. You dang donkey, you got to keep it down to a dull roar. And then he stole lines from people like Mark Twain. There's your opinion and my opinion, and in the middle there's the truth. And then he said, you don't know your ass from your elbow, your ass from a hole in the ground. Your mouth runs like a whippoorwiller's ass in a windstorm. There was a lot of ass.